All right, praising God for this time variety. Understanding if I haven't already thanked God for that, this is a good time, at least in my estimation, because I want to take a different approach to this chapter. Not all that different, but I don't want to focus as much on the organization, probably just kind of cheating, because as I said in the previous chapter, Hosea does not provide me as the easiest source of material to organize, but this chapter seems easier than most. Either way, I want to take a different approach in Hosea chapter 8 that I want to call the whirlwind for a very famous passage in verse 7, which goes to the crude organization I want to offer for this passage as I then move into simply making comments on isolated verses that I think go to what I see as a central theme, I think, in chapter 8. But with that, the first 6 verses or so are going to seem to deal with some lies that Israel had bought into, lies that are attracting God's judgment. Judgment that he is going to describe in verse 7, a verse that I'm going to describe as kind of a hinge or a fulcrum on which the chapter seems to turn, as he is going to go in verses 8 through 10, or into in verses 8 through 10, a description of allies that they are also relying on to their detriment, as in verses 11 through the end of the chapter, 11 through 14, he is going to revive a familiar theme. All those things adding together to sum up to the basis for which he is going to, or basis or reason for which, he's about to bring them into judgment, which is what he's going to talk about in more detail in 11 through 14. But that crude organization aside, I want to talk about the thing that seems to be kind of a central chord, I think, running through the reason why they're attracting judgment. And it's the lies they bought into, as we already mentioned. Idolatry is something we have talked about before, but the lies that they're buying into in this chapter seem to take 3, maybe not 4, maybe 5 different forms that really give us a more detailed picture, at least for me, a more detailed picture of idolatry. Understanding that the first lie I think I saw comes in verse 2, where it says, "To me they cry, my God, we Israel know you." The first lie has to do with their identity. Even if they are the people of God, it's a name only, reminding me of times that I've seen folks go on game shows, specifically dating game shows. And I'm thinking of a particular famous couple that went on one of those shows that asks one spouse about the other's particular likes, wants, desires, all that kind of stuff. And it's a super embarrassing opportunity for people to, even though they're married, expose exactly how little they know about the person they spend that much or basically committed to spending their life with. And so likewise here, even though Israel is still wearing the name of the people of God, God himself is saying, you don't have to go on a game show to prove that you don't really know a whole lot about me. And so that's one lie they bought into. They are maintaining, like we said, the personality of being the people of God, but God is helping them to understand that the substance is lacking. As he's going to talk about in verse 4, they have made leaders that fit what they want, but are completely inconsistent with the things that God has called them to do, which might have something to do with the second half of verse 4, where he's going to go into more detail in the second half of verse 4 through verse 6, talking about their idols, because they seem to have spent more time focusing on their myths about reality. They have begun to choose leaders that fit their myths as opposed to the reality of who God is. Understanding that the myths were kind of demystified for me the more I began to think of them in terms of a conversation I had a while back, where some folks were talking to me about how things work overseas. And it seemed mid-conversation that I was just kind of sitting there silent. They realized I had lived a few places overseas. And the things they were describing about life overseas had nothing to do with the reality that I experienced in a few different places that I had been. And I realized that as I sat there silent and they looked, seeming to kind of catch what was going on, they did not necessarily want to ask, how does that compare to your actual experience? As much as they simply wanted a picture of life overseas that fit the myth they had created about what it's actually like outside of the States. And for that reason, idolatry is one of those things that simply gave Israel the freedom to make up whatever myths they wanted to about reality, whether or not they made sense. How do we know? Because God is talking about the way in which, as they have pursued their myths, they've strayed further and further away from the truth of what life is actually like, which is why he is so upset with them in the first place, as we have seen through much of the book of Hosea to this point. But going on from that, as we said, all of this is adding up to verse 7, where he says, for they sow the wind and they shall reap the whirlwind, the famous passage that, for me, having gone through the chapter and really the Bible to this point, really sums up to a sub-theme that we have seen before, which is, with the measure we use, it will be measured back to us. But we do not know the proportion with which God will finally say enough when he's done repaying us for the wrongs that we do. Likewise, God willing, on the positive end, to the degree that we have done good, he uses the same rule, and he says, for those who have given generously or given in a good spirit or according to genuine, I guess, human decency, he will likewise measure back to you abundantly, using the same measurement, but not necessarily stopping with the portion that you handed out to others in the season in which you were doing good or showing kindness to other people. But I'm at 6 minutes now, so I need to wrap up. Likewise, he is going to go on to talk about the way in verses 8 through 10. Like we said, they had made allies, but they're going to be repaid with those alliances in the way that, as we have seen before, those allies, once they have partnered up with Israel to do evil, they're going to turn on Israel and do evil to Israel. This time in the form of verse 10, the tribute that they are going to demand of Israel once they have gotten the upper hand on them is going to exhaust them and probably make them regret the alliances they made with people based upon convenience as opposed to character. The idolatry, I guess, as I've called it, in those verse 8 through 10 alliances, which might just be the fallacy or the false hope they put in those alliances in verse 8 through 10, giving way to the fallacy in verse 12, which is the more that they have ruminated and lived their lives according to their own myths about what reality is actually like, the less they are able to recognize the human decency discussed in God's law, understanding that the fact that they've left the good behind was something they talked about or God talked about earlier in the chapter. And now he's talking about the way that they no longer would recognize his law. If he multiplied it by the thousands to them, it would seem strange. Reminding me of YouTube videos I watched recently. I mentioned on Wednesday night of these creators who create content based on controversy. They go up to people and they say some out-of-pocket things, as we would call it. And some of those creators, they had rational expectations. They knew if they got swung on, they were saying some pretty outrageous things to people. Others seemed absolutely confused at the fact that anybody would want to hit them for some of the things that they were saying to people that were what we would typically call, the law even recognizes as fighting words, as it makes certain things like disorderly conduct, a crime that acknowledges there's certain things you can say to people that make it real likely you're going to start a fight. So as these guys seem super confused on these YouTube videos about the consequences they're getting, the foreseeable consequences they're getting, it reminded me of what God seems to be saying here in this chapter, where Israel had become so preoccupied by its myths about life that they lost track of the very foreseeable consequences on deck for them.